And so, we begin. I'm Captain Nala Ake, Chancellor of Starfleet Academy. We're all the first Academy class to return to our campus in San Francisco after more than 120 years. Some of you are here for your families, some for yourselves. Together, you are the best and the brightest from across the galaxy.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fandom Frontier, the channel where we're boldly going to review some movies and TV shows. My name is Kati, and last time I reviewed the Star Wars show Andor. But for this review, I am finally honoring the namesake of this channel by talking about Star Trek. More specifically, I'm going to review the first season of the newest Star Trek show, Starfleet Academy. As of the date I'm recording this, the season has just finished, with the 10th episode, the season finale, released on the 12th of March, so very recently. And because this is such a new show and I want to give everybody the opportunity to watch and enjoy it in their own time, this review will only include some minor spoilers, because I will be going over the characters and timeline to establish it within the wider Star Trek franchise. But mainly, I don't really want to focus too much on the actual plot of the show or whether or not I think it is good in terms of production quality and writing, though I certainly think it is. Instead, I really want to use this review to argue that it is a valuable and even necessary expansion of the franchise, and particularly that the reaction of a certain group of fans, by which I mean very conservative and right-wing viewers of the show who have been extensively hating on it for its diversity, how that reaction and all the hate that the show has received is very telling of the important work that still remains to be done when it comes to representation. And it is also very telling that even a franchise and a fandom as inclusive and progressive as the Star Trek fandom isn't safe from people making fun of a show or pushing against the show simply because it doesn't align with their racist, homophobic, misogynist, and ableist ideologies. And so, even though I very much enjoyed the show itself, that to me is secondary to how important I think it is to even have a show like this in the first place, especially in Star Trek, a franchise that is famous for its history of diversity. And so, as a Star Trek fan who actually understands the core values and the core philosophy that Star Trek is built on, I think it is my duty, to a certain extent, to talk about those core values and that core philosophy, and how Starfleet Academy perfectly aligns with it, and to push back against all the hate that the show has received simply for representing what Star Trek has always been about. Now, before going into this review, I just want to preface this by telling you that I am a huge Trekkie, so you can trust that I know what I'm talking about. I mean, I think most people in my life just know me as the girl that's obsessed with Star Trek. I've kind of made it my entire personality. I've written so many Star Trek essays. I'm currently writing my BA thesis on Star Trek. I've drawn Star Trek fan art, I've written Star Trek fan fiction, I've done Star Trek cosplay, I've made Star Trek fan edits. I mean, the amount of Star Trek merch I own is quite literally insane. And I've been a Trekkie for almost all of my life. It is something that's very personal to me. In fact, I come from a family of Trekkies. A lot of people in my family grew up with Star Trek, and in turn, I grew up with it as well. I still remember watching it with my family every single day when I would come back home from school. It was the one thing we were always allowed to watch, even on a weeknight, even if we had an exam the next day. And there's a lot of Star Trek out there. I mean, did you know that all 12 Star Trek shows and all 14 movies amount to a total of 723.3 hours of Star Trek? Yup, I calculated that. That's pretty much exactly 30 days, or an entire month of non-stop watching. And I've seen all of that, and more than just once, on top of novels, comics, and video games. And through all of these shows and movies, and the long history of this franchise, what has always drawn me to Star Trek are its core values and its core philosophy, which I think is best summarized by a quote of the creator Gene Roddenberry himself: "Infinite diversity in infinite combinations." Star Trek is a utopian vision of the future, full of optimism and the belief that humanity will survive its growing pains like wars and the environmental crisis and create a peaceful and united society. It is set in a time where there are no more wars, no hunger, no poverty, no hoarding of wealth, no exploitation. A future without racism, without misogyny, without homophobia. It shows us that such a future is even possible and how it might be possible. To me, more than anything I've ever experienced, Star Trek is about hope. Hope that humanity can do better and will do better, that we will survive these current times and we will build a future that is more equal, more inclusive, more sustainable. A future that is for all of us.
The whole show was an attempt to say that humanity will reach maturity and wisdom on the day that it begins not just to tolerate, but to take a special delight in differences in ideas and differences in life forms. We tried to say that the worst possible thing that can happen to all of us is for the future to somehow press us into a common mold where we begin to act and talk and look and think alike. If we cannot learn to actually enjoy those small differences, take a positive delight in those small differences between our own kind here on this planet, then we do not deserve to go out into space and meet the diversity that's almost certainly out there.
This philosophy is present in all of Star Trek, and to me, it is very much the core of the entire franchise.
We're out here to explore, to make contact with other life forms, to establish peaceful relations, but not to interfere. And absolutely not to destroy.
And that is why I am here. Not to conquer you with weapons or with ideas, but to coexist and learn.
The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
I am female. I was born that way. I have had those feelings, those longings, all of my life. It is not unnatural. I am not sick because I feel this way. I do not need to be helped. I do not need to be cured.
Centuries ago, in most places on Earth, only landowners of a particular gender and race had any rights at all. Over time, those rights were extended to all humans. And later, as we explored the galaxy, to thousands of other sentient species.
You prepared to condemn him and all who come after him to servitude and slavery. With the first link, the chain is forged. The first speech censored, the first thought forbidden, the first freedom denied, chains us all irrevocably. The claim I was only following orders has been used to justify too many tragedies in our history. But she, or someone like her, will always be with us, waiting for the right climate in which to flourish. Spreading fear in the name of righteousness. What you're doing here is unethical. It's immoral. I'll fight it.
Now, I believe that these core values of Star Trek are very much present in Starfleet Academy. But exactly because of that, the show has received a ridiculous amount of hate from fans who can't believe that the franchise has suddenly turned woke, no matter the fact that this has always been what Star Trek is about. But to understand that, let's actually talk about Starfleet Academy and its context. When people go into the show, they're bringing a lot of emotions and expectations with them, based on what has been happening in the franchise over the last few years. A lot of viewers simply already decided they were going to hate the show before it even aired. And honestly, even I was skeptical, though for a completely different reason. My skepticism came from my own experience with the most recent Star Trek projects. While I absolutely loved Lower Decks, I really didn't like the later seasons of Star Trek Discovery, and I particularly disliked Section 31 and the latest season of Strange New Worlds. In my opinion, those are some of the weakest Star Trek projects we've ever seen, and they honestly made me pretty worried about the future of this franchise. The main reason for that is that, to me, it kind of felt like the spirit of Star Trek wasn't there anymore. It felt more like hollow entertainment with a Star Trek logo on top, and the character arcs and dialogues felt flat and uninspiring to me because there was a lack of these political values that Star Trek stands for, those ideas that are baked into the very DNA of the franchise. Those were the ideas that at least I was missing from the latest projects. It felt a lot like Paramount just wanted to appeal to the widest audience possible, including a very conservative audience, and was scared to offend anyone. It felt a lot like they were afraid to speak out on anything at all, afraid to make any kind of political or even philosophical statement, afraid to use these stories as commentary on the world, which is what Star Trek has historically done best. So going into the show, I was genuinely concerned. But my concern was that there wouldn't be enough Star Trek in it, or enough of the Star Trek spirit in it, while the main concern of a lot of the people already hating on the show online seemed to be that there would be a gay character. Wow. Because apparently they think that Star Trek has never done that before? Anyway. Another thing I was unsure about going into this show is the setting. As the title suggests, it is set at Starfleet Academy, which means the premise is kind of a Star Trek version of a high school or college drama. And while I was excited to be focusing on a younger cast of characters, I was worried that it might just end up as a generic teen drama with Star Trek branding slapped on top. And, you know, a lot of relationship drama, a lot of interpersonal conflicts, but not a lot of deeper substance. But I'm happy to say that's not what this show is about at all. Yes, it still has a lot of stereotypical teen drama elements, that's part of the premise and part of the tone, but this is a show that genuinely captures the soul of Star Trek. The story takes place in the far future, after the events of Star Trek Discovery, in the so-called post-burn era, the burn being this catastrophic event that has basically shattered the Federation and destroyed much of galactic infrastructure. But what's interesting is that Discovery never really fully explored the extent and consequences of the Federation's failure. We know that the Federation has collapsed, but we never really got to see how deeply that affected people. This show really dives into that, because these characters grew up in a world without the Federation. They didn't grow up believing in Starfleet ideals, but in a galaxy where those ideals had already failed them. And now they're the first generation back at Starfleet Academy in more than 100 years. It creates this really interesting dynamic between the older characters, like the Doctor from Voyager, who grew up during the golden age of the Federation and still fully believe in its ideals, and the younger generation, who is more skeptical because the Federation hasn't lived up to its promises. And that tension creates some really great storytelling. Another thing I really appreciate about the show is that it isn't afraid to tackle political issues. Instead, it really explores the political landscape of the current era of the franchise. Because the show is set so much further into the future, a lot has changed since Kirk's era or Picard's era, both culturally and politically, and it is really interesting to see how the show deals with that. For example, we are introduced to Jaden, a Klingon character, and the show kind of uses him to explore what happened to Klingon society during the burn, because the Klingons are in a very different position now compared to earlier eras like TNG. But at the same time, the show treats Klingon culture as something with an ongoing history. It acknowledges that cultures evolve over time while still carrying their traditions and identities forward, and that's something I really appreciate. Because ultimately, this isn't a show that just relies on nostalgia. A lot of modern franchises fall into this trap of constantly regurgitating the past, bringing back old characters, old storylines, and trying to make the audience feel the same way they felt decades ago. But this show isn't afraid to engage with Star Trek as an evolving universe. It's willing to change things. It's willing to explore new ideas and possibilities for where the future of this franchise might lead us, while at the same time still understanding and honoring the core philosophy that makes Star Trek Star Trek. And that balance between evolution and tradition is exactly what I think the franchise needs right now. At first glance, the characters of this show might seem like pretty classic archetypes, you know, the popular kid, the genius, the quirky outsider, the bully, all these types you'd expect from a college show. But the interesting thing is that all the characters come with a twist. They might initially appear to fit into these familiar boxes, but the more time you spend with them, the more you realize they don't actually fit those boxes at all. The writers merely use it as an entry point and then complicate them in really interesting ways. Going back to Jaden, I think he's a perfect example for this. When you first hear that he's a Klingon, you might expect a very particular type of character because Klingons in Star Trek have been portrayed as warriors, physically imposing, aggressive, and honor-driven fighters. But Jaden is a warrior in a completely different sense. He's a warrior with words. And on top of that, he has anxiety, he's a med student, he's a pacifist, and he's gay. All things that have caused an insane amount of outrage online. Certain corners of the internet have completely lost their mind over the fact that there is now a gay Klingon. But unconventional Klingon characters are nothing new. In fact, the most famous unconventional Klingon of the entire franchise is probably Worf from TNG, aka the first Klingon to ever join Starfleet. His entire character arc was about navigating Klingon identity and his upbringing outside of Klingon society in a way that didn't always conform to the stereotypes of Klingon culture while still honoring it. So this idea that Klingons have to fit into a rigid mold has literally never been true. What Jaden does is expand that culture even further. He opens up new possibilities for what Klingon identity might look like in the future of this franchise. And that's the kind of storytelling that Star Trek has always thrived on. On top of that, there's this really beautiful historical connection between the character of Jaden and the conversation about queer representation in Star Trek that goes all the way back to its very beginning, when George Takei, who played Hikaru Sulu in the original series and who also happens to be gay, talked to Gene Roddenberry about having an openly gay character on the show back in the 60s.
I had suggested that idea. You know, we've been dealing with every social issue, and the gay issue is another important one. And have you ever considered addressing that? And he said, you know, you're right. I'd like to do that. But he said, I'm walking a tightrope. The interracial kiss was very controversial.
Right, when Captain Kirk kissed Lieutenant Uhura, it was like unbelievable.
A black woman. And so I've got to keep the show on to tell the stories that I'm telling, which aren't being dramatized metaphorically on any of the other show. I've got to keep the show on.
So the idea that queer representation is somehow a betrayal of Star Trek's legacy is completely backwards. If anything, it's a continuation of the values the franchise has always pushed forward, even if television at the time wasn't ready for it. And something that has really disgusted me when watching the online discourse around the show is how certain YouTube thumbnails for hate reviews keep targeting the black characters specifically. They love to call this show slop and then use AI-generated images or distorted screenshots to make fun of the characters of Jaden, Sam, or Laura Thok, making them seem ridiculous or unpleasant. And then there's Elon Musk commenting on this photo of 3 women saying, "Turns out they banned Ozempic and LASIK in the future, LOL," which, what kind of argument is that? And one of the characters specifically in that photo, Laura Thok, has been getting a lot of hate, with people online attacking her because,
It's a fat black woman.
I mean, are we serious? That's just straight up discrimination. And these same people constantly claim to care so deeply about Star Trek canon, but they seem to twist it to support their outrage and conveniently forget all the times when it doesn't. I mean, one of the main reasons they hate her character is because she's half Jem'Hadar, and there are no Jem'Hadar women, according to canon.
There are no Jem'Hadar women.
But if any of them had actually bothered to watch the show, they would know it addresses that, because it is revealed that her father is Jem'Hadar, while her mother is Klingon. So the writers very clearly paid attention to existing lore and respected it. And the show actually features a lot of Easter eggs, callbacks, and references to earlier Star Trek episodes, specifically to Jem'Hadar culture.
I am dead. I go into battle to reclaim my life.
As of this moment, we are all dead. We go into battle
to reclaim our lives.
Ironically, the people screaming the loudest about canon are the ones completely ignoring it. And as you just saw from Elon Musk's comment, there was also outrage about the character of Captain Nala Ake wearing glasses. Yes, glasses. Because some people were so offended by the idea that anyone in the future would still need glasses, because apparently we would have cured that by then. But that completely misses the point. Star Trek isn't about erasing disability under the guise of having cured all that in the future. It's about creating a society where disabled people are respected, included, and have the same rights as anyone else. The perfect example of this is Geordi LaForge from Star Trek The Next Generation, who used his visor to see. His disability wasn't erased, it was accommodated for. And even if certain conditions could be cured in the future, which would be great, that still doesn't change the fact that we live in a world right now where disabled people exist, and they deserve to be represented in stories about the future. Also, just remind me of who's the most famous character in all of Star Trek to ever wear glasses? That's right. It's Captain James T. Kirk himself. It is so clear that none of these complaints are actually about canon or curing disabilities, but about policing whose bodies are allowed to exist in the future and in our imaginations of the future. And honestly, it just makes me really angry, because there's an entire ecosystem out there of online creators pumping out video after video with the exact same talking points, the same clickbait title and disturbing thumbnail, just to manufacture outrage about this stuff and profit off of it. And the irony is that these people actually call themselves Star Trek fans, while Star Trek has been openly opposed to the kind of politics they're pushing since the very beginning. It's the same energy as people who cheer for the rebellion in Star Wars and imagine themselves as the heroes, while actively supporting the exact kind of authoritarian ideology that the Empire represents. The cognitive dissonance is honestly incredible. And the worst thing is that these people present their takes, which are often openly racist, sometimes bordering on literal eugenics, as if they're legitimate criticism. I guess that these creators just hope their audience is full of idiots who have either never actually seen Star Trek or just conveniently forgotten pretty much everything about it. And maybe the funniest example of this is the suggestion that Paramount should just hand over control over the franchise to William Shatner, the actor of Captain Kirk, so that he can save Star Trek and restore its good old Christian and American values. Which, first of all, William Shatner is 94 years old. You really want to give him full control over the franchise? And second, Christian values? American values? You do know that William Shatner is Jewish, right? And Canadian? Yeah. Come on. At least do 5 minutes of research before declaring yourself the guardian of Star Trek. In the end, I'm just really disappointed that this genuinely good show, full of everything that makes Star Trek, is getting buried under all this undeserved hate. And on top of that, many of the reviewers and fans watching the show are millennials or older, and they simply don't have the same connection to it that the younger generation of Trekkies has. But I'm the one actually represented by this show. Yes, there are younger characters in other Star Trek media, but they're often still professionals, with working experience, doing their job on board of these starships. But this is a show about students, like me, and it shows the weight that these young adults have pushing in on them from the outside, all these responsibilities and expectations, whether from family, their peers, or themselves, and these larger issues that are part of their world, like political issues, environmental issues, and other injustices. But it also shows that these people are just trying to find their place in the world. They just want to have fun and relax, hang out with their friends, and enjoy their time at school. And that's something this show shows really nicely. There's these overarching storylines, but their danger or intensity never fully overshadows the everyday life of being a student at Starfleet Academy. And that's something I really appreciate, because much like TNG was about expanding the universe to a new generation of characters and fans after the original series, as the title The Next Generation might indicate, this show is doing the same thing. It's opening up the franchise for yet another new generation. My generation. And that's the beautiful thing about Star Trek. It evolves as its audience evolves. That's it from me. If you've seen Starfleet Academy, let me know your thoughts and whether or not you enjoyed it. If it's simply not your cup of tea,
Tea, Earl Grey, hot.
that's totally fine. But if you've been unsure whether or not to watch it based on all the hate it has received, I can only implore you, please just give it a try and form your own opinion. Just beware, there's a high probability that you might end up actually really enjoying it. And if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm Kati, thank you for watching, and live long and prosper.